Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome to you all. My name is Alan Hoare from the Technological University of Dublin and the Construction IT Alliance. I want to welcome you all to CitA's Aistriú Circular Economy in the Built Environment series, which is designed in association with the Irish Green Building Council, the Chartered Institute of Building, and Goa Mayo Institute of Technology. As you're all aware, circular economy is very important for all stakeholders in the built environment, for our designers, for our product manufacturers, for our constructors, and for our policymakers. So in this series, we'll be setting out a vision by identifying, I suppose, intervention points, deciding on strategies, and that work best for your project and how to implement a circular economy strategy in your business and your project. So without further ado, I'm going to ask some of our partners to say a few words. So if I could ask perhaps for James Kilroy to say a few words on behalf of the CIOB.
It's
Joseph Kilroy.
Thanks,
Apologies.
Alan. No worries. Thanks so much, Alan, and to the team at CitA. I am the Policy and Public Affairs Manager for Ireland with the CIOB. I just wanted to take a brief minute to say that we're delighted to form this partnership with CitA and to kick it off with what looks like a really interesting session today. And I should just say a special welcome to all of our CIOB members in the audience. I just want to take a second just to say a word about CIOB's policy and research presence in Ireland. As of 2020, we have a dedicated policy and research function. And this partnership indeed with CitA is part of a wider program of research and policy, which includes an upcoming piece of research on working conditions in the construction sector, which we're doing with Task, the think tank here in Dublin. That will give us a good idea of what's going on in the sector pre and post COVID. And we're also just kicking off a project looking at the location of new housing development. And we're examining, I suppose, in the context of some of what we'll be talking today, we're examining whether we are building to sustainable development patterns. And then finally, just on the education front, in 2021, we're hoping to roll out the CIOB degree apprenticeship model here in Ireland. We've already rolled it out in the UK very successfully, and we've had very positive conversations with the Higher Education Authority, so we're hoping that will happen in 2021. I won't take up any more of your time. I hope you enjoy the day. It's a really stellar lineup. So I'll pass you over to Mark.
Thanks, Joseph. And my name is Mark Kelly. I work in the Department of Building and Civil Engineering in GMIT and lead the Build 360 research group in GMIT, which focuses on the circular economy in the built environment. We're delighted to be participating in this webinar series. And as Joseph mentioned there, just really looking forward to the lineup and the speakers today. So I hope everybody enjoys the webinar, and I'll pass you over to Pat.
Good afternoon. We're delighted to be participating in this, partnering with both CitA, GMIT, and CitA. And I suppose it's really important that we reach as wide an audience as possible. I just want to talk briefly about some of the projects that the Irish Green Building Council are going to be involved in over the next couple of years, focused on circularity and whole life carbon. I suppose as we move beyond NZEB, we are looking at we've updated the building regulations in Ireland, and we've gotten down to quite a low level of energy consumption for new buildings. So now we're transitioning to looking at resources, and that is the next huge challenge that we have. So over the next 3 years, we'll be focusing on 3 projects, and this we were focusing today very much on circularity, but it's very much linked to the other work we're doing around the levels framework developed by the European Union, which is a framework that we think is going to have real legs, because it is going to be the way that we integrate circularity and into building regulations, into procurement, and very importantly into taxonomy, into green bonds, green mortgages. So just to give you an oversight, we have just started work on Building Life, which is about creating a huge campaign across the whole of Europe to integrate whole life carbon into European directives. It's about integrating whole life regulations into Irish regulations. And you've seen the campaign we have started with leading ambassadors in Irish industry who are going to support that. We're also working over the next year in developing a national roadmap to put in all the bricks that are needed to actually move towards regulation of whole life carbon and embodied carbon. And we will be delivering some of those bricks through a number of these projects, including developing a database of generic materials, developing that generic data. We'll be developing an early stage LCA tool that will be free for the whole industry to use, that will allow designers to at very early stage measure the impact of different options and different types of construction. We will be looking at how all of those indicators get integrated into public procurement and how they get integrated into our home performance index tool. So we'll be looking at LCA, indoor air quality, life cycle costing, and circularity indicators. And we'll be trialing several different levels, framework indicators for circularity with design teams over the next year or so. And then it's all about integrating that into taxonomy. We're delighted to announce that last week, Home Building the Home Building Finance Ireland have released the first green development product. They are now offering a 0.5% discount for all homes that are built that are certified to the Home Performance Index. So that's a real, that's going to make a real difference now, because I suppose the banks were previously offering energy efficient mortgages, but now we have a chance to really align around circularity and life cycle assessment, and really align with taxonomy, and then offer builders an actual discount for developing to higher standards. So I suppose I won't say any more. I think Audrey Nugent is the head of advocacy for the European Regional Network with the World Green Building Council, and she's going to talk about how circularity and life cycle assessment, how that is now has risen to the top of the agenda in Europe, and what we can expect to see over the coming years in regulation. So I'm now going to pass over to Audrey, who's going to talk a little bit about the policy.
Hopefully everyone can hear me and see my screen. Yeah, okay. Someone will shout if they can't. Great.
Good.
So yeah. So my name is Audrey Nugent. I'm the head of advocacy at the World Green Building Council. So we're a network of green building councils who operate in 5 regions around the world. We have about 70 members. I work specifically in the European network on policy and advocacy. So working with green building councils like the Irish Green Building Council to promote circularity and advance life cycle policy, particularly in the context of the European legislative framework. So there's a lot going on the EU policy side at the moment in terms of buildings, and what I'm going to do now is just talk you through some of the key policy frameworks, the EU Green Deal, and what that might mean for our sector going forward. Before going into the details of the different policy aspects, I just want to do a little bit of a context setting of why the European Commission is putting such a big focus on addressing the environmental impact of our sector. So I'm probably preaching to the converted when I say this, but just as a reminder, across Europe, buildings and our sector is responsible for 40% of energy consumption, 36% of CO2 emissions, 50% of all extracted materials, and 35% of the EU's total waste. So there's a huge environmental footprint that our sector has. And if the European Commission is going to meet the goals that it has set out under the terms of the EU Green Deal and ensure that we're on a trajectory that keeps us within 1.5 degrees under the Paris Agreement, then we're really going to need to change the way we look at addressing the impact of our sector. And we are very much focused on, in the World Green Building Council, the need to start looking at the operational and embodied carbon of a building. So that's the term we use as whole life carbon, to consider that in the policy framework in an integrated manner. The EU really needs to take a leadership approach here. There's very few countries that are on track, and we need a lot of things across a lot of different categories to happen to make this a reality. The good news is that the Ursula von der Leyen was elected last year, and she promised an EU Green Deal for Europe, which will see Europe aim to become climate neutral by 2050. And on the back of her election, or her appointment, I should say, we're seeing a lot of momentum in terms of the policy framework. So what I'm going to do is just talk you through the key aspects of the EU Green Deal and the potential impact that will have on our sector. So essentially, the Green Deal is a series of policy initiatives across many different areas, and the overall goal is to ensure that Europe achieves climate neutrality by 2050. So it's really an action plan that's aimed at, using our resources more efficiently, restoring biodiversity, cutting pollution, and enabling that move to a circular economy. And then within that, there's a huge series of policies, frameworks that have been adopted. And what I'm going to do is just quickly run through the ones that are relevant to the buildings and construction sector. So they're listed here. It's the Circular Economy Action Plan, the Renovation Wave, the European Climate Law, and the targets that support that. And then, as Pat mentioned, there's a lot happening now in terms of the finance agenda and the taxonomy. So I just really wanted to flag that as well, because I think that's something that's becoming increasingly relevant to our sector, and it's going to have a huge impact in the future, I think. So firstly, I just wanted to talk through the aspects of the Circular Economy Action Plan. So the Circular Economy Action Plan was published, I think, last March, and it identifies different sectors where, circularity principles need to be incorporated. And the construction and building sector was identified as one of the key ones where movement needed to happen. So this promises to promote circularity in the buildings and construction sector and integrate life cycle thinking via a number of different avenues. So first of all, there's going to be an update to the construction products regulation. So that's currently going through quite a difficult consultation process at the moment. And that aims to address the sustainability performance of construction products, and also considering, introducing provisions regarding recycled content, as long as that doesn't obviously undermine any safety features. There's also this idea of developing digital logbooks that will, bring in circularity and aspects on improving durability and adaptability of the built assets, and linking that up with circular economy principles. Pat has mentioned the role of levels. This is going to be a really key framework to enable and deliver many of these policy ambitions. So this strategy promises to consider how the levels framework and the indicators within that can be integrated into public procurement, the EU Sustainable Finance Framework, and also to start using levels as a basis to start a discussion on whether or not it is appropriate to set carbon reduction targets. So moving away from traditional energy efficiency targets in the operation stage, but start looking at them from a carbon perspective across the whole life cycle of a building. And then lastly, the action plan, or the strategy for sustainable built environment, will also look at considering a revision of material recovery targets in EU legislation. So there's a lot of commitments there that the Commission have committed to look at under the strategy for sustainable built environment. The strategy is a little bit delayed. We, with our network of Green Building Councils, will be feeding into the development of that. So the Irish Green Building Council's voice will be heard in that. So please do get in touch with Pat if you have anything to feed into that. I briefly touched on levels, and so did Pat, and I know that Stephen's going to talk about it in a little bit more detail, but I just thought in the context of this discussion on the policy framework, it was just important to flag what levels actually is, for those of you who may not know. So it's a framework that has been developed by the European Commission to report on the environmental performance of buildings across their whole life cycle. and it focuses on 6 key areas. So greenhouse gas emissions, resources and circularity, water, health, adaptation, and life cycle cost. So it's the first time that, the European Commission has started to consider looking at a building's impact beyond just energy efficiency. It's been developed in collaboration with industry. It's taken quite a long time. And now the next stage is to figure out how the indicators within levels will actually underpin many of the initiatives in the EU Green Deal and eventually potentially be part of legislative directives. So I just wanted to kind of give that brief overview because it will come up again. Another aspect of buildings policy from the European Commission is the Renovation Wave. This is flagship policy of the EU Green Deal, and the aim is to ensure that by 2030, 35 million buildings across Europe are renovated and that the renovation rate in Europe is at least double. And the reason the European Commission are so committed to this is because most of the buildings in Europe that will exist in 2050 already exist, and most of them are woefully energy inefficient. So in order to meet climate targets, even from an operational perspective, we really need to start looking at the renovation aspect. So I'll just quickly talk through what the key elements of the Renovation Wave are and how that will obviously at some point come into legislation in Ireland. So the first aspect of the Renovation Wave is this idea of minimum standards. So the Commission is going to propose mandatory minimum energy performance standards as part of the review of the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which is going to take place towards the end of this year. A key focus of the Renovation Wave is the need for deep renovation. So the Commission hope by introducing digital building logbooks, they'll be able to integrate all of the data from various different initiatives so that the homeowners have kind of a more seamless journey than they do at the moment. And the other aspect of that is, access to data, which again is a huge issue. So the European Building Stock Observatory is going to become a central repository for building data. The other aspect of the wave, I think, that's worthwhile noting is just the financing aspect. The Renovation Wave communication was published last year around the same time, that COVID was emerging. So the kind of narrative shifted from the European Commission in terms of the role that the Renovation Wave could also play in creating job opportunities. So a lot of the funding for the Renovation Wave has been allocated to the recovery and resilience plans that member states are submitting to the European Commission at the moment. It's also going to look at, upgrading the system of EPC so that can assist banks in developing green loans and mortgages. And the other aspect then is just this idea of a neighbourhood-based approach. So traditionally, if you're just doing it building by building, it's not integrated, it's not cost efficient, and it's not having the impact that needs to be seen across Europe. So this idea of a neighbourhood-based approach with one-stop shops is aimed to transform communities and create new business opportunities. And again, that's linked back to the idea of the recovery plans. And then lastly, again, just talking about whole life carbon, and this was a welcome surprise for us, was the Commission have developed a commitment to put a 2050 roadmap for reducing whole life cycle carbon emissions in buildings. So bringing the conversation on circularity and the life cycle approach into the Renovation Wave, which there'd been a bit of a disconnect before. So that's the main point of the Renovation Wave. I think what's really important to make, especially at the member state level, people aware of is the amount of funding that exists across, different platforms from the European Commission. So our colleagues at Renovate Europe have put together this slide which shows, the direct EU funding that has been channeled towards renovation, leveraging private finance, so from the European Investment Bank and also the Horizon programme. So there's a lot of money that's available for renovation activities. And the issue is now, how do you bring it from the European level down to the local? And Renovate Europe, who we're partners with, and I know the Irish Green Building Council are a member of, are doing a lot of work on how local authorities can access this money. So I think there's a huge opportunity there as well. And then I just wanted to talk about quickly, like there's a lot going on, as you can see, in the European buildings policy sphere at the moment. And there's a lot of things that need to happen quite quickly. So in order to achieve climate neutrality, the European Commission is going to enshrine that into law. So there's lots of discussions taking place this week about that. There's also an increased ambition in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions to at least 55%. And because of those, new commitments that are being made, the existing directives that we're all familiar with, the Energy Efficiency Directive, the Renewable Energy Directive, and the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive are going to need to be updated to reflect those increased ambitions. So we'll be doing at World GBC a lot of advocacy on that, and the Building Life project that Pat mentioned will be feeding into the reviews of those directives and advocating for this move towards whole life carbon. And then lastly, I think I'm near time, I just wanted to touch on something that Pat mentioned, which will also have an impact on this space, which is the sustainable finance agenda in Europe. So this program called the Taxonomy, essentially. So this is something that's causing a lot of consternation amongst different stakeholders who work in Brussels, but essentially the taxonomy is a kind of a tool which sets performance thresholds for economic activities which make a substantial contribution to one of 6 environmental objectives. So it's economy-wide, but the buildings and construction sector is obviously in there. So the taxonomy is currently going through consultation and discussions, and it's, like I said, it's generating a lot of chat because some people are worried about it and the impact that it may have. But in terms of the building and construction industry, what this means is that if you are an investor and you want to say that your building that you're building or investing in is compliant with the taxonomy, then you need to prove that it meets certain performance thresholds against this climate change mitigation criteria, and that it does no significant harm to these other bullet points that you can see underneath that. So this represents a huge change in terms of, how investors might invest in buildings and buildings that are deemed to be compliant with the taxonomy. I won't go through these into detail, but I just thought it would be useful to put them up on the screen. These are still in consultation with the network of stakeholders who are working in this space. But essentially what this means is if you're an investor and you want to say this new building is taxonomy compliant, then it will need to be at least 20% lower than the threshold set in NZEB. And it'll also need to be reporting if it's over a certain size on the whole life cycle emissions. So there's a lot there that needs to be considered. And there's also requirements on buildings renovation and acquisition and ownership. It would need to be an energy performance certificate class A. So there's a huge amount of conversations going on. I think it's going to take a couple of months until we get the criteria on this. But I think what's important to know is, this will probably at some point become like, I don't want to say law, but I think it's really going to change the way that, the buildings are designed and built, and circularity is going to be part of that conversation as well. So then lastly, I just wanted to conclude there. There's obviously a lot going on. There's a lot more that I could have talked about in a lot more detail that I... Oh, am I still here? Okay. Sorry, I thought I'd dropped off. It looked like I dropped off. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of finish on the fact that, this Building Life campaign that Pat talked about, that's really key for us in terms of how we're doing our advocacy and working with the network of stakeholders to build the infrastructure to deliver on these policy ambitions. So with Building Life, we'll be looking at, how do you align procurement criteria? How do you build the capacity of the sector? How do you get the awareness going? And how do you get, the political side on board as well with this? So there's a lot going on in this space, and I think it's really important that the stakeholder community across Europe, in Ireland, are really feeding into that development, so we can actually go to the Commission and say, this is what's realistic, this is this is what the sector is doing and this is the level of ambition that exists, and actually work together to make the goals of the EU Green Deal a reality. So with that, and my headphones falling out, I'll pass over, I think, to Stephen, who's going to talk about levels in a bit more detail.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Audrey. That was really comprehensive because there's a huge amount going on. So that was a really good summary. So that was fantastic because it's very hard. It's very hard for even us to get our heads around everything that's happening at a European level because it's happening so fast. So I'm going to pass over to my colleague Stephen now, who's going to go into, if you can share your screen, Stephen. He's going to talk a little bit go into a little bit of detail about levels, how it's structured, and we'll be focusing this time very much on the circularity indicators in levels to give you an overview. It's over to you, Stephen.
Okay.
Yes, Stephen,
we can hear you.
It's gone very quiet, so I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay.
We can see you, we can hear you, and we can we see your slides.
Okay,
you want
cool.
to turn on your video?
Okay, so hi everybody. I'm here to talk about levels, and in particular how it relates to circularity in the built environment. Levels is the common EU framework of core sustainability indicators. It's designed to enable professionals from across the built environment to make a clear contribution to broader environmental improvements at a European level. It's not another certification scheme, it's more of a guide to the key principles of sustainability. It has two main stated aims. The first one is to provide a kind of a common language of sustainability for buildings across the EU. It aims to achieve this by defining indicators that are common across projects and ensuring their comparability by measuring them using the same metrics and criteria. And secondly, it's there to promote the use of LCA and life cycle costing across the EU. LCA is important for understanding not only the quantities of our emissions, but also the timing, and LCC can help us achieve reductions in cost in tandem with reductions in these emissions. It's built on 6 macro objectives, and you can see them here for the sustainability of offices and residential. These objectives focus on greenhouse gas emissions, resources and circularity, water, occupant health and well-being, adaptation, and life cycle costing and value opportunities. So for each of those 6 objectives, it's supported by between 2 and 4 indicators that help to guide and focus a design team further. These indicators are measured using common metrics across projects to be developed and comparisons to be made. By using common metrics, we ensure we're addressing the same challenges. We can compare and evaluate multiple design approaches at different stages, and we can learn from one experience to inform the next. The new structure of levels means that each of the 16 indicators now follows a similar pattern. There's guidance on each indicator, which details how to approach it depending on the level of involvement or relevance with your project. And you can choose the appropriate level for your project for each indicator. A level 1 is now a kind of a qualitative assessment, and this is carried out at the conceptual design stage. It provides an accessible entry point into each indicator and introduces the concepts to be considered and the reasons why the indicator has been included. It encourages wider reading on the specific topic, in particular the results of previous studies in the area, and that'll help a team. It will help a team's understanding of how the decisions that they make now impact future outcomes. It helps the design team quickly kind of assimilate information it needs to address the problem, and whether or not it needs to do further study, a level 2 essentially. So a level 2 is a quantitative assessment, and these take place at the detailed design stage. It builds on that knowledge acquired at level 1 by providing a methodology and a unit of measurement for each indicator. By using the same unit of measurement, building designs become more comparable in a more scientific way than a level 1 assessment, which is purely qualitative. And this allows for more rational decision making. Quantifying also helps the team to evaluate the indicator in relation to their specific project. You ask yourself the questions, which are the indicators that matter the most to you, and what options do you have to address them? And finally, a level 3 is monitoring. So these take place either at practical completion of a build or during the occupancy of the building. And this is where you get actual feedback. You can compare that to your level 2 modelled results. And by continuing to gather data after completion and monitoring actual performance against your level 2, a building remains comparable during its useful lifetime. And we can get indications of what works in practice and how well this compares to our original design results. Now, each indicator now comes with a manual to help you understand the topic, and where relevant, reporting and tracking templates are also provided. The manual is broken down into an overview, a how-to guide, and then where to go for further details and anything else you may need to be aware of. And it's worth noting that as well as choosing the level, choosing the indicator, you should also do this at the beginning. They may not all be relevant to your specific project. So you can work at different levels on different indicators, which dependent on your objectives or your client brief. But by establishing a plan at the outset, this will help you kind of define roles and responsibilities and figure out what kind of data you may need or any extra research or consultancy. So, sorry. Most indicators are independent of one another and they all have their own guidance, but they all rely on the same building description. So by following a description template and having normalized data, we get more comparable projects. With regards to circularity here today, that's covered by macro objective 2, resource efficient and circular material life cycles. But of course, design decisions taken have implications for other macro objectives too. So it's worth thinking about all 6 objectives in the round to find the right balance for your project. For example, extra materials to incorporate the opportunity for future upgrading may come at a financial cost and, of course, environmental costs further with greater use of. Number 2 then, it addresses how we design with the future in mind, and it looks at 3 key issues. Waste. What waste are we going to generate in the construction process and then in demolition beforehand? How can we minimize it? How can we find alternative uses for it? If it has a use, then it still has a value. Adaptability. We know that refurb and renewal is almost always lower impact than new build. So we should consider how will we renew and repurpose a building if a future market changes, or in the case of residential, as families grow and change and age. And finally, we need to think about deconstruction. What we choose to put into the buildings now will eventually have to come out. So we need to think about that. How easy is it to take the building apart again? And when we do, what use will the materials have when we recover them? If we think about that now, the building becomes not only a building, but also a store of useful materials. But for level 2 and level 3, we're going to need to establish a bill of quantities at the outset. This will need accurate inventories and design information. And this will help us to measure our impacts, estimate our wastage, understand how our building can be modified, and eventually how it can be taken apart. The bill of quantities is also useful for life cycle analysis, life cycle costing. So you can see how these indicators within levels do have some crossover from one macro objective to the next. So looking at construction and demolition waste, It accounts for around 30% of all EU waste. The vast majority of it is inert. So construction and demolition activities present opportunities to divert waste away from landfill and back into construction material loop. Average recovery rates for construction waste across the EU are only 50%, which means a lot of harmless material is not being reused or repurposed when it could be. The aim of this indicator is therefore to promote systematic planning for the reuse, recycle and recovery of waste using segregated collection on site. So if only a level 1 study were carried out, the guidance asks for you just to consider the concept and inform yourself about the concept and develop just simple rules of thumb, something like perhaps you make it a rule of thumb that you bring nothing to site without either a plan to fix it permanently on site or a plan to for how it's going to leave site. For a level 2 study, a user can use the bill of quantities and applied rules of thumb for each material to make reliable quantitative estimates of wastage and record them in the levels inventory template. This template also has guidance for level 1 and for level 3. You can see you base your inputs on your bill of quantities, rules of thumb provided by levels, and it just helps you track your wastage both in terms of volumes and its final destination. So when we design for adaptability, we know that renovation and repurposing of existing buildings almost always has a lower carbon cost than building new. So it makes sense that when we do build new, we do it in such a way that accounts for future renewal and future modification and repurposing. A building's service life may end earlier than its potential design life if it can't adapt to changes in market demand or the needs of its occupier. As it's the structure and the facade that usually come at the highest environmental cost, if the useful life of these can be extended, there can be significant environmental benefits as we avoid the need to build new again. This highlights the importance of considering at design stage how future flexibility and adaptability to changing needs can be addressed. So the International Energy Agency has identified 3 main ways in which building designs can be more adaptable: a more efficient use of space, more effective usage as occupiers' needs change, for example, as a business or a family expands, which in turn may mean the need for more usable space. Increased longevity, if we can extend the total lifetime of a building, ensuring that this lifetime reflects the design life of the components, like the structure, this will reduce the need to incur significant environmental impacts related to another construction phase. And finally, the improved operational performance. Easier changeover to new is what we're talking about. To new technology. This could include technological innovations in lighting, heating, or even energy generation. What's important is that we ensure that services are accessible and therefore upgradable when the time comes. There are similar concepts for offices too. I'm not going to go into them here because it's the same kind of concept, and you can access these slides after the session. Levels provides a systematic weighted scorecard for both residential and for offices, and this helps the design team to think about what elements of adaptability they can design in at the early design stages. And finally, designing for deconstruction. Building elements such as structures, envelopes and facades account for the majority of the embodied impacts of a building. Moreover, multiple renovation cycles of internal fit-outs means lots more material passed through a building over the years. By designing for the recovery and reuse or recycling of materials, we contribute to a reduction in impacts at the industry level. The problem is the disconnect between decisions made at the design stage now and those that are going to be made several decades from now when it's time to take the building down. Studies of demolition and deconstruction practices have identified 4 main barriers for material reuse. The first one is in the building design. Current construction methods and materials don't support the recovery of materials. Examples include contamination with hazardous materials, entanglement of surfaces with structures, and the use of composite steel and concrete systems. Similarly, demolition processes, current practices here, they don't support recovery of materials in a usable state. Examples include using shears to cut steel sections because they were welded together, or just to get the job done quickly. And there's a lack of space to store reclaimed materials. And there are also questions that need to be asked around the modification that's required to make them useful again. And finally, there's a lack of demand for reclaimed materials. And this may be constrained by supplying what's available against what is actually needed. But there's also questions around a used material's properties and its provenance. Whilst building assessment can't address all of these aspects, they can have an important role to play in identifying aspects of building design that can influence end-of-life recovery processes and decisions. I find the best way to think about this is just to think about Lego. If you think about Lego, there are standard shapes and they fix together mechanically. They don't have any adhesives. They're very hard wearing. They come apart very easily. And the ways of putting them together are almost infinite. So by measuring and recording the ease of disassembly of building parts, by selecting materials based on their suitability for reuse or recycle, and by selecting materials that we know already have established reuse and recycling pathways, we can set the direction for the building's future. Levels sets out a unit of measurement for scoring the deconstruction potential of a building, and these scores can be reported across each of these aspects of recovery, ease of recycling, and ease of reuse. So those are the elements of levels that speak to the circular economy. I would just like to say for those that may have been aware of levels before October last year, it's now, since the October relaunch, if you like, it's much more clear and joined up. There's a consistent approach to all of the indicators. It makes it a lot more accessible than the versions that were in testing last year. Instead of levels of detail, which sometimes seem like overkill in those original manuals, the updated manuals now show when and how to approach each indicator, and they give good guidance on what needs to be considered. And overall now, I think it's a much more coherent and multifaceted framework to base design decisions on. And I think that's it from me.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And we will be doing a lot of work on these indicators over the next 2 years. I'd like to point out that this project is actually supported by EPA Green Enterprise, not Life Levels. Our whole work around circularity. Now we have David Philp is global BEM consultancy director with AECOM, and he's going to talk about the digital aspects of the circular economy.
Thank you, Pat, and hopefully you can see my screen okay?
We can see your screen, we can see you and hear you.
Excellent. That's a good start. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting us to the presentation this afternoon. So I'm David Philp. I'm Global Building Information Model Consultancy Director at AECOM, and it's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon. So also I could say a big shout out to all the CIB members who have joined this afternoon as well. So it's a real privilege. So, well, what's my talk about? It's actually how digital can start to enable a circular economy. And one of the things that we're really starting to see is there's a new narrative evolving in our sector that's very much starting to think about value and outcome-based driven. And I think one of the big things that we're seeing at AECOM is we forge new transformative relationships with our ever-evolving technologies and ever-increasing data use cases. We are now willing to be able to use digital as a means to move from the high-waste linear that Stephen talked about to a much more altruistic and circular economy. So that's going to be the big assertion for us this afternoon. But actually, I want to turn the clock back a bit and actually just put your mind back if you can. You might have seen this before. But, you know, we've talked about reform many, many times within there. You can see some of the key words that sit within there. We talk about efficiency. We talk about procurement reform, collaborative approach, contractor involvement, and better training. So I think I'd have let anyone wants to put maybe into when they think that quote was actually written. There you go, 1944. We've been talking about these things for 80 years. You know, why did it never happen? And I think if you go back, I always think this is a great report, Never Waste a Good Crisis, Construction Excellence Report. And one of the things it said, we've got to think different. We've got to start thinking about not about construction per se, but more of a wider built environment. And when we start to do that, we can start to think about value that's created over a whole life within there as well. And I think when I look back in my career, I think it's always been about clients asking the industry to change. And I think to get the circular economy to work, we need a much richer partnership between clients, industry, and more importantly, end users. And I think it came up there in the chat window as well. I think there's a huge part in terms of our education base within there as well. But I think the big thing for me is when we have these conversations, we need to think in terms of a built environment. And we look at it, it's a prime candidate for applying a circular economy. And I think when I think about digital and data, it's about thinking about how we can bring value and use it to actually help us understand whole life performance. And also to think more about how digital and data can support whole life investment values. And I think that's hugely important as well. And it's something we've talked about. This is Paul Morell, who was our first Chief Construction Advisor in the UK. And that's one of the things that Paul said, you know, we have to start to think more and more about behavioural change. I think, if anything, this needs to be a call for procurers to think very much about the value profile of their projects, and how data and technology can support it. And I think it's also that behavioural change as well, but we're starting to move there. And I think you can see one of the big things, if you've got the Construction Innovation Hub in the process of creating a value-based toolkit to help make this happen as well. But one of the things I think we've got to think actually, what is a built environment? And again, another great paper to point people towards is a paper it's called Flourishing Systems. It's by the Centre for Digital Built Britain and also the Smart Infrastructure Centre at Cambridge University as well. And it starts to put within there, you can see within there, it creates 3 layers: an economic infrastructure, a transport, energy, telecoms, water and waste. We also think about our social infrastructure in terms of schools, hospitals, residential, commercial, but we also have to think, I think, when we think very much about our circular economy, how this all sits within a natural environment. And I think to get this to work, we must start to think about how we think about bringing this together, how we reimagine how we view and operate over there. So a big part for me is thinking, and this is something that the paper promotes, is very much thinking about people focused, recognizing the fundamental value that our infrastructure brings in both social, economic, right through there, and how it can affect the quality of lives as well. We've also got to think about it systems-based as well and recognize that infrastructure is complex and it's interconnected as well. And I think this is where we start to think about the value that digital and technologies is going to help us to be able to manage our assets for the whole life much better, manage material resources through many life cycles, and I think that's a key enabler of our circular economy as well, but also to understand which are often complex trade-offs, especially in terms of net zero greenhouse gas emissions within there. So I think it's hugely important we can understand what it is in that context of the built environment. Within the series of talks as well, you hear from one of my colleagues, Dave Cheshire, who's a sustainability and author of Building Revolutions, and this is a model that Dave promotes within there. It's about designing for a circular economy, and it's not about promoting building for less, I think. And you've heard from Stephen, it's about building differently with more thought to the future within there as well, which is hugely important. I think, well, how does BIM and technologies help us? Well, when you look at design out waste, design for adaptability and assembly, there's many players with there. And a big thing I think we can start to think about is how our technologies can help collaboration, bringing people together from these disparate areas and start having a much more critical view in terms of how we can start to think of a regenerative built environment, which I think is hugely important. So you'll hear more with our colleagues with that one later on. Well, how does this fit with AECOM and digital? Well, at AECOM, we've got a lot of data. You can see we push it right through the whole project lifecycle, through 306 degrees, all stages of the asset data lifecycle. I think this picks up on something that Stephen was saying. We use 12 phases to help standardize the way we look at what we call our data eras. It can either be an object, a product, or a system within there. And these characterize the reliability, the usability, and the specific purpose as it changes from each area of the asset. And as Stephen said, one of the things we want to make sure is we're not disconnecting data, because the continuity provides value. I think as Stephen points out, we want to make sure, actually, these disconnects, especially in terms of deconstruction, we can look at all the parts and actually how we can use it as well. And it's also supporting, we believe, much more the RMI, that reuse, maintain, and improve marketplace as well. And through data-rich technologies such as building information model, we're starting to get that data continuity. And that's allowing us to rehearse different scenarios, to test them, to try and get the better performance within there as well, and start to really monitor our assets as well. So the big part for us that we leave in terms of that circular economy is how digital and data can create that golden thread. At the same time, we're seeing lots of our clients starting to, through policy levers, starting to push it, especially in terms of transforming productivity through advanced industrialization. Also thinking about higher performing assets much more as well, thinking about social value and building sustainability, and some big targets that we're working towards as well. But the big thing is we're starting to see a much more move from our clients to think about digital support and whole life costs, and how we're going to do it in terms of reducing greenhouse gases, especially in the back of a green recovery from COVID. And I think the big thing now is actually how do we start to think about advanced industrialization and the value that platform design for manufacture can do within a circular economy as well. We're also seeing that digital is becoming a key part of better understanding our assets. Starting to think more about smart buildings that are going to adapt because they're often underutilized and inefficient. So actually making our existing building or retained stock work harder, become more digitized, and be able to look at their performance in a much more real time, and to think about adaptability. But we saw in the UK government start to move towards this circular economy and digital back in 2016. And we've talked about a shift, if you like, how digital building information modeling tools were helping us do more for the same, better planning, better briefing, and better design and construct. I think that's been happening probably for a decade now. But we're starting to move into using digital for better operating less, better record keeping within there, which is fabulous. But this is where we think the paradigm shift. Better service provision. How we can start to monitor in real time through digital twinning, through smart sensors, but start to think about optimization and start to shape demand. Actually look at how things are performing in real time. And I think this is where we get the real value of digital, where we can start to think about how it can shape strategic financial investment planning and start to think about how it can support better social values as well. So we think digital and data can really help create that circular economy. And we're starting to see maturity with our clients as well. I think for the last couple of years, a lot of our clients, it's been about capital efficiency of projects, building information modeling, better information management, common data environments for collaboration, and smart assets start to help, all underpinned with standards, get better efficiency of projects. But we're now starting to see capital efficiency of programs, starting to think much more, especially in terms of repair and maintain, how these technologies, but along with geospatial program management, is now thinking about efficiency of program level. But we start to think more and more about the circular economy when we start to think about the digital twinning. And we're at that point now where we're looking at whole life asset performance, real-time data capture and analysis. And one of the things we are seeing, again, in the UK, moving towards a national digital twin, start to use information management frameworks to actually connect twins within there as well, which will start to give us that wholly true life system performance data that we much need. So we think we're moving not so much about doing more for less, but now better measurement, better insight, better investment, and doing more with the stock where they got back. And through sensor technologies and analysts, this is for me the big part. We can start to measure and get feedback on asset performance and really start to shape investment. At the same time with COVID, we're also building less as well. You know, we're saying actually, do we need physical assets as much? This is one of the virtual public consultation rooms we've been building. So we're starting to see thinking completely different. And actually how we can think about social value through much more digital and virtual environments as well, which you can actually reach a wider audience and sometimes more physical ones. It's actually buying wider and more buy-in from, especially in terms of major infrastructure projects as well. One thing that I think is really important is soft landings, and we've been lucky enough in the UK to have a government soft landings, a key agenda item since May of 2011. Well, what is it? I think it talks a lot of things that Stephen pointed out, but it's very much about improving the value, and it aligns the interest between those who design and those who use it. That's a big, big part. Better briefing, better alignment, and the voice of the customer coming right the way through the whole process. And David Hancock and the Infrastructure Projects Authority just reminds us that actually, by creating the best value and opportunity and setting monitor performance targets that are more effective, actually it's about creating better value. And soft landings provides, if you like, an appropriate pathway and support. So if you haven't done it, there's lots of guidance out there, and the standards around it, BS 8536, are still free to download as well. Well, what is it essentially? It is about that 360-degree circular life cycle. It's about setting better understandable user needs through better briefing, setting required performance outcomes, but start to actually measure through structured post-evaluation, optimization against actual performance outcomes, and actually feeding back lessons learned as well. So a truly circular way. So soft landings is a great way, I think. And again, it can be decoupled from digital, but it works so much better when we've got a digital environment to support, especially collaboration. We're seeing clients such as NHS Scotland using these tools to start to think about ensuring clear operational objectives, but thinking about right from a circular economy point of view as well. This is one of the tools we're seeing with our National Health Service in Scotland, thinking about a whole way right through the whole project lifecycle, but with clear objectives about end user and performance and setting metrics. And they're starting to use it again to actually test with. They're using digital environments to simulate and test the soft landings process, design versus target performance, but then comparing it to the commissioning process, monitoring, fine-tuning. So using digital and soft landings to put a convergence within there that's very much focused on better outcomes, not just in terms of financial, but functional performance and the environment as well. Same client, our NHS Scotland, is also looking in terms of how digital fits with their existing estate. They're one of the biggest asset owners. I think the average age of their assets is around about 26 years, and they're looking at an information management-led approach that they call the digital estate to better understand their existing estate, how it's performing, and have reliable joined-up information that's going to help support better forward investment and healthcare outcomes. And you can see within there, it's a proof of concept of their technology, the common data environment that helps them be able to search right across the whole of their portfolio, or right down into a health board, be able to find an asset, drive down, find all the information, all the details, and start to make better, smarter decisions within there, especially about reuse and repair, maintenance, improve within there. So start to see clients think about digital support, not just new capital investments, but increasingly about the disconnects and how they can better reuse the assets they've got. We're also seeing as maturity increases as well, starting to move to much more thinking about digital twinning, frictionless flows of data between the physical and the digital environments within there, that complete digital representation, but through sensors and smart operational technologies, much more pervasive sensing and actuation. So real-time data feedbacks and through data analytics simulation, we are creating a real circular understanding of assets performance, which means we're starting to get much more better carbon targets. And I think sometimes the best way to show you is our own office in London. You see some of the real-time data that's coming in, and start for us to be able to maintain and get better, much more circular outcomes from our own assets within there as well, which is hugely important. So a maturity, digital representations, but now coupled with key data in real time that's allowing us to analyze it and make smart decisions about our assets. And you can see within there some of the things we're moving to much more predictive maintenance. You can see there using data science, we can find out what we call pre-failure mode. So we can actually react. We don't have to wait in a trigger event of something going wrong. We can find data patterns and models and actually start to predict the future, which has given us that move very much into that circular economy. You can see some of the things that we're looking at in terms of, we can monitor in terms of air quality, lighting, but how people are using our assets as well to get much more performance as well. So to sum up, we think that we are moving in a transformist direction. We think it's technologies and data, and we are really in the move towards, if you like, our circular economy. But right at the heart of it is we still believe it's people and process that are supported by data and technology. So thank you for hearing our story.
Thank you, David. That was really interesting, incredible technology and connectivity there. So I think we're now going to move to a panel discussion. So if the panelists could turn on their camera, if anybody wants to ask a question, the best place to do it is in the chat box. We're not going to attempt to take live questions from over 200 attendees. So there's quite a few questions have come in already, and I'll just pop them to the panel. I see a question here. Is it feasible for Ireland to aim for a solution such as the legislation introduced by Copenhagen municipality last year, which would require all new buildings to have an LCA completed in tandem with the construction? Who'd like to take that? Maybe Audrey? Or is that legislation?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the reality is it probably needs to go that way if we're going to meet what we're going to be seeing in terms of the European directives and what that means in terms of when it's imposed in national legislation in Ireland. And there's a lot of countries who are already taking a leadership approach. So I'll try and find it and put it in the chat box. But for example, the Finnish ministry, they're looking at targets for whole life carbon, I think by 2025, and carbon limit values. And they've just published some criteria around that. So they're really taking a front runner approach. And there's the E+C- regulation in France, which is just being developed. The Netherlands have had LCA for a number of years now, and they're now looking at broadening that scope. And then countries are also looking at these countries to follow and learn from them. So I think not only is it feasible, it is going to happen. It's just a matter of creating that infrastructure to deliver that policy, which has been mentioned in the chat box in terms of the skills and capacity, the data that we need to start setting those benchmarks and those targets. But yeah, I can try and find out those links and share them in the box now.
And I think another question for you, Audrey. Does that digital logbook, does it also apply to commercial property?
I think they're still defined. This is one of the fun things when the Commission come out with policy announcements. The detail isn't always there. So I think the digital logbook, the idea is to, in 2023, look at the feasibility of that. I was looking it up this morning. So I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to double check on that and get back to you guys.
There was also a question about biogenic carbon. I'm not going to ask you to, maybe Stephen might answer that. Whether global warming potential will include biogenic carbon or sequestered carbon value.
Yeah, it's a tricky area. The temptation when doing life cycle analysis is to deduct your sequestered carbon from your whole life carbon figure, which really is a bit misleading. If 60 years from now you then just incinerate all of that carbon that you had sequestered, then you haven't really saved it over the whole lifetime of the building. You've just temporarily held it. So life cycle analysis, kind of the general consensus is that you report it separately. If you have a coherent plan for disposal of the building, which doesn't involve releasing that carbon, then yes, you can include it. If you don't, then you can't say for sure that that carbon is sequestered permanently. It's a tricky one.
Very good. There's a question on the digital logbook and whether that will build upon the whole idea of material and building passport concepts. That there's been projects such as building of material banks, and maybe David, you'd like to respond to that. Is there an opportunity to utilise the synergies between the digital transition and the circular economy transition?
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think especially as we start to bring in, some of our electronic ledgers within there. I'll be honest, it's not an area of my expertise, but I think there definitely is an opportunity to digitise with there, especially around about some of the security roundabout as well within there. Pat, apologies, not my area of expertise, that one.
It is one thing we will be talking about a bit later in this series. We have the Materials Exchange, which is a platform in Holland. We'll be talking about material passports and how that can be made available between countries, and between how you can get dating networks to get in a flow of materials. There's a couple of platforms coming out of Holland now, the Madagascar, that allows the creation of a digital twin where all of the digital passport, material passport for each product in the building, and that allows an exchange of information.
What I'm seeing, Pat, especially in Scotland, is our demolition contractors here becoming much more knowledgeable in the use of digital, and especially in terms of data capture. They're coming into assets that maybe don't have as much history or the data on them, but they're using sort of data captures, laser scanners and such like to get the geometry. They're using thermal imaging, but the big part is they're now starting to use models to actually look as to how, rather than put to landfill, how they can be repurposed and reused within there. So we're starting to see much more, the demolition, those that are there, starting to think about moving much more into that repair move rather than demolition. And actually, they're, I think, often using digital to reinvent themselves within there.
Right. Another question. If LCA was required in every building, is there a sufficient knowledge base in Ireland? I mean, are there enough people educated in carrying out LCA, or is there a course that can be done? I think, Stephen, you can answer that one.
No, there isn't sufficient knowledge at the moment. There's my course.
Sorry, that's the wrong answer, Stephen. I was just about to say that you're building up that knowledge in Ireland at the moment.
Yeah, there isn't enough knowledge there at the moment. There are good standards out there, good methodologies, but they're not widely shared enough yet.
Well, actually, I suppose what I was prompting to say, Stephen, is that we are actually running a course on whole life carbon for the past couple of weeks. It has been filling up rapidly every time we put it on. So we've been running it every 2 weeks over the past 2 months. So we will be continuing to run out that course on whole life carbon for as long as there's people to come onto it. And at the moment, there seems to be incredible interest in learning about whole life carbon. So if you're interested, go to our website. It's very low cost. That is funded by the Life Levels project. And we'll be continuing to roll that out over the next year. We're hoping to reach total mass penetration of knowledge around LCA in the professional sector here in Ireland over the next 2 years.
You're a better salesman than me, Pat.
So does our current legislation regulations facilitate greater reuse or repurposing of construction and demolition waste? Are the EPA promoting this further to allow further adoption and application in Ireland? We'd like to, maybe Mark, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I suppose the regulations don't really encourage it, but it's usually the last thing to happen that it gets embedded into the regulations. The EPA, in fairness to them, over the last decade probably, and through Pat's projects that were listed there with Circular Life and previous projects, have been very supportive of looking at starting off with construction demolition waste to resource efficiency and now to circular economy. What's become more evident over the last couple of years is to disseminate this sort of research projects more widely across the industry. And I put up a couple of links there just to some outputs around it. But the EPA has a working group, and there was a number of recommendations and things submitted for the Waste Action Plan for Circular Economy. Some of them came through, but there's some more work to be done on it. And I suppose what the reason why the EPA is providing funding for these projects is they actually want to see an evidence base. And that's why they're very keen on, obviously, industry engagement, but also, exemplar case studies. Do these concepts that everybody's talking about and that we've heard about for a number of years, do they actually work in reality? So I'll give you a very short example of that. Over the last number of years, we've been sort of exploring the whole material passports concept, but we've primarily been working with a construction SME. And to be honest, has never been asked for. They've never actually been asked for a BIM requirement on the size of the project. So it was a bit of an exploration that we did. So from a main contractor at their scale at the moment, materials passports and building passports is maybe a nice thing to be involved in, but it's not a requirement. So they're not going to throw a lot of resources at it. They're happy for us to play around with the data and to be creating them and exploring them. But because it's a competitive tender or traditional procurement where they just hand over the building to the client and there's no sort of link between the design, build and operation, they're not really concerned about it. So, obviously at a larger scale with digital twins and all of that, there's been a lot of leaders in Ireland in that area. There is work beginning on that, but we mustn't forget the whole SME sector and to try and make these principles as practical and as feasible for them as possible.
Great. There's a great conversation going on in the chat box, by the way, because if you go to the chat box, you can see a lot of these questions are answered. There's some great links in there of all of the things that we have discussed, including the soft landing framework. There's the Drive, Technical University Dublin are working on a very interesting project around renovation and circularity in renovation. The question about how many people can carry out an LCA, well, I think we answered that already. We've trained up nearly 45 people in the past couple of weeks. So there's more than 4, definitely. To what standard? But at least there will be more and more people able to carry out an LCA over the next over the next year. The good question about if LCA becomes mandatory, who would audit the LCA? That's an interesting question. Who would like to answer that? I suppose the analogy is we've got building energy assessors at the moment, and they're very strictly audited by SEAI. What sort of mechanism would be needed to make sure people are doing it correctly? Does anybody want to come in on that? Put up your hand if who would like to answer that.
I would just say on that you need a lot of evidence in an LCA. In my experience, people want to boil it down to one number per square meter. So 500 kilos of carbon dioxide per square meter of embodied carbon. But it's never that simple. You need to have a defined scope for your building before you can put a number on it. So I think we have the standard, which is EN 15978, but you need to show you're working out. You need to be transparent. So we need some kind of templates that cover all of the modules within that standard and really break it down. There's the RICS have a good whole life carbon table that breaks down a building by module in time and building element, and really kind of breaks down what's included in those final numbers that people want to see. So I think it would be something like that we'd be looking for.
Great. There's another question about the whole digital passport and whether that should be integrated with the building energy rating system. Is there any thoughts on that at a European level, Audrey?
Sorry, I was on. Yeah, I think there's lots of conversations and there's lots of lobbying about the different aspects of how all of this comes together. I don't know if there's any clear answer yet on what the direction of travel is. Like I said earlier, a lot of this is kind of signposting to future policy, and then the detail is being worked out with stakeholders. So yeah, I don't have a kind of a firm answer, I think, to give on that at the moment, unfortunately. I think that is probably what the community would like. So that's probably what's going to be advocated for towards the Commission. I've just put in the chat box as well a link to a report by someone you work with, Pat, BioNova, which explains the different, some of the questions I saw in the chat box before I got kicked out a few minutes ago were about the limit values. So that might be useful for for those of you who are asking that question.
That's right. BioNova just completed a report for the Finnish government, which sets out potential limit values for different building types for use in their building regulations. It's very interesting, and potential optimizations that can be made to reduce carbon across the whole life cycle. I don't know if there's any other questions. If anybody else would like to come in on any of the things we have talked about. I think there's a question here on BIM. If anybody's aware of any project in Ireland which has been designed with a BIM solution for facility management, so that operations and maintenance use the same BIM model from the start of a project to post-completion?
I could maybe give a bit more a general overview. That we're starting to see, a lot of capital models. So you've got a design model that's grown into a construction model and to an as-built. But generally, what we're seeing is the as-built model is archived, and then if you like, there's a lighter version of the operational model that's then created off the back of it. Because, for instance, we don't need to have an operational model that's got all the details of our foundations or a structural detail, and we always go back to the as-built model. We're finding there's a lot lighter operational model where we stripped it back, looking at the maintainable assets and their attributes, and then linking that up to other systems, so asset registry systems, to computer-assisted facilities models in there. But the actual model itself is a lighter version generally within there. And I've seen a few, I think it's coming out. I was going to say the same thing. BAM in Ireland, we've seen a few good case studies there. I don't know which particular projects, but I know they're doing it as well. So we are starting to see it growing. But I think the main thing is the construction model is generally a lot heavier than the operational model. It's getting something that's proportionate and can be used by the facilities and estates teams within there as well. But it's becoming a top hat. It's more about linking it to other systems as well. So you go into your model, say quick and air handle unit, it's going to give all your data that's linked from the CAFM system or the asset registry from there. So it's becoming, if like, a unifier as well as that portal to all your information.
Great. We have a question on modularization and off-site manufacturing. I know it's taken off very much in the UK and probably to a lesser extent so far here. Does anybody have an opinion on how that will assist a transition to more sustainable circular economy? Will it aid or will it impede a move to circularity, depending on how it's done?
Pat can maybe give you a wee bit, if you are right. I mean, what we're seeing is UK government moving, in assumption, the central government departments of what we're calling PDM-FMA, Platform Design for Manufacture, the kits of parts, but also the integration rule books that go alongside it. And from a digital point of view, when we create these objects, it's a lot easier then to actually build in by standard, embedded carbon targets within there, the interface rules. So as Stephen said, when we come to, maybe reuse those components, everything's already built in. So as we build these kits of parts for government departments, it's becoming a lot easier to get that standardization. It's also getting a lot easier in terms of creating configurators around about it as well to give us, in terms of be it base cost or sustainability. There's also one of the things that's been done in the UK at the moment is it's called an information management framework to look about data sharing between sectors as well within there, so especially in terms of complex, in-service carbon questions were there. So my view is definitely not moving that direction. And will it make life easier? I think 100%. It's also going to make it a lot easier, I think, to procure for value for these solutions and all the data.
Well, as well, it's an interesting question. If you're looking at the module itself, about reuse of a volumetric module, isn't the key issue that that module itself is going to have to be completely future-proofed so that it could be reused at the module level as opposed to the product level?
I think in the UK we're moving to much more moving towards the sub-assemblies, the kits of parts, so you could have an active roofing system or such like, and a volumetrics might be something that comes into it, but much more I think focus on creation that's how you can configure sub-assemblies, and that may include, if you like, your volumetrics within there.
Okay, I think we are now a little bit over time. I think we were supposed to finish at 10 to 2. So I would like to thank everybody. I'd like to thank our co-hosts, GMIT. Alan, do you want to come in and say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank everyone, to Audrey, to Stephen, to David. Great, fantastic presentations. I've learned an awful lot. Delighted to be involved in this series. Pat, I think you did a great job in holding the program together and getting us out on time. To Joseph and to Mark and to Pat and Suzanne, putting together this trilogy of partners to focus on the circular economy is fantastic. And I think this series is only going to get stronger. You can see there we have a full program laid out right through March until December. So I hope you continue to join us. It was a testament to the quality of the presentations today that we held over 200 people right to the end. So it's fantastic. I know it's difficult for people at the present moment trying to juggle things at home and so on. So again, to the backroom team, to Shannon and Elenia, to Sam, and to all the team in CIOB, GMIT and IGBC that did all the hard work in the background. Really superb event, and stay connected to us, and we'll see you all in March. It was great.